The wind howled like a wounded beast, pounding against the wooden shutters and forcing snow and ice through the cracks in Junie Rice's cabin. February 1882 arrived with such ferocity that blood ran cold, transforming the outskirts of the mining town of Cedar Ridge into a white and unforgiving wasteland. Junie sat by the fire, her calloused hands silently working with needle and thread, mending a shirt that had seen better days. Her gray eyes, the color of a winter sky, reflected the dancing flames as the wind battered her solitary refuge. She had chosen this isolation after what happened, after burying her husband, Samuel, and the child who never uttered a first cry. Words dried up in her throat like autumn leaves. The town remembered her as the most skilled midwife in the county, a woman who had brought half a dozen generations into this world with strong hands and a compassionate heart. But that was before cholera had taken everything she loved in one cruel week. Now, at 32, Junie lived on the very edge, literally on the outskirts of town, where gossip reached like distant echoes and people left her alone. Her cabin, built by Samuel's own hands, stood on a slope among pines groaning under the weight of snow. She had chickens, a small garden waiting for spring under an icy blanket, and silence. And that was enough. It was supposed to be that way. A sudden knock at the door startled her so much she dropped her needle. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the neat sound of a polite visit, but desperate, feverish, as if someone was pounding with fists instead of knuckles. Junie froze, her heart beating hard. No one came to her after dark. Thump, thump, thump. Now louder, more insistent. Through the wind, she heard something else, a hoarse male voice pierced with cold. "Please, help!" Junie slowly rose, letting her sewing fall to the floor. Her bare feet moved quietly across the wooden boards, approaching the door. She could hear her own quick, shallow breaths. Her hands trembled as she reached for the latch. "My child is dying, please." The words, "my child," pierced her like an arrow. Without hesitation, Junie opened the door. The winter wind slammed into her face, filling the cabin with a swirl of snow. On the threshold, a tall, thin young man swayed, with several days' growth of beard and eyes full of despair. His coat was worn, his boots cracked, and his lips had a bluish tint from the cold. But what made Junie's heart stop was the small bundle clutched to his chest. A baby, wrapped in a blanket that had long lost its freshness. "She's dying," he said with difficulty, his teeth chattering from the cold. "No, she hasn't eaten for 2 days. I have no milk." His legs buckled and he collapsed onto the threshold, instinctively shielding the girl with his body. Junie knelt beside him without a second thought, brushing snow from his face, but her gaze was fixed on the child. Even in the dim firelight, she saw that the baby was dangerously still. Her skin had a grayish tint, and her breathing was so shallow it barely stirred the blanket. "Come in," Junie whispered hoarsely. These were the first words she had spoken aloud in weeks. She helped Cole to his feet, guiding him inside and closing the door against the storm. He staggered towards the fire, still clutching the child tightly. His eyes were glassy with hypothermia and despair. "Give her to me," Junie said, extending her hands. Cole hesitated, as if fearing that by letting go of his daughter, he would lose the only thing he had left. But the insistence in Junie's gray eyes convinced him. With trembling hands, he handed her the tiny child. Junie's heart ached. The girl was so tiny, so fragile, it seemed she could break with a single breath. Her lips were chapped, her cheeks sunken from exhaustion, but she was alive, she was breathing. Without a word, Junie headed to the bedroom. Cole tried to follow, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto a chair by the fire, trembling uncontrollably. In the privacy of the room, Junie sat on the edge of the bed and began to unbutton her nightgown. Her hands moved from a memory she thought she had buried forever. It had been almost 3 years since she had nursed a child, since she had lost her own. But her body remembered. She had always had plenty of milk, even after her loss. It was a cruel reminder of what she had lost, the physical pain accompanying the emotional. But now, holding this little stranger to her chest, the pain transformed into something else, almost sacred. The baby struggled faintly at first, too weak to latch properly. Junie murmured softly, words emerging from the depths of primal instinct. She gently touched the girl's cheek with her finger, stimulating the rooting reflex. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the tiny lips closed. A sensation shot through her like lightning. Pain, relief, loss, and hope all mingled in a moment that stole her breath. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the baby began to suckle harder, relaxing her tiny body against Junie's chest. "That's it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's good, little one." From the main room came the sounds of Cole moving, heavy footsteps on the wood. He was probably anxious, trying to understand what was happening. But Junie couldn't move, couldn't interrupt this fragile and precious moment. The child nursed for 20 minutes, her tiny fists clenched and relaxed on Junie's breast. The color of her skin improved, the grayish tint replaced by a healthy pink. When she finally fell asleep, fed and peaceful, Junie allowed herself to examine her carefully. The baby had dark hair, barely visible under her faded wool cap. Long, thick eyelashes casting shadows on her chubby cheeks. She was beautiful, as only children can be. Perfect and innocent, unaware of the tragedies that had brought her into a stranger's arms. Junie carefully wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and returned to the living room. Cole had taken off his soaked coat and was sitting as close as possible to the fire, stretching his hands out to the flames. He looked up when she entered, and the relief in his eyes was so palpable it almost made her step back. "It's all right," Junie said softly. "She's sleeping." Cole buried his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I thought I would die," he mumbled through his hands. "I thought I would lose everything I had left of her." Junie didn't ask who she was. Some questions don't require immediate answers. Instead, she went to the kitchen and began to prepare tea. Her movements were automatic, calming in their familiarity. She boiled water, took 2 cups from the cupboard, and added honey to the chamomile tea she had dried last autumn. "What's her name?" she finally asked, nodding towards the sleeping baby. "Lita," Cole replied, lifting his head. "Her mother wanted to call her Belind, but I thought Lita was simpler, stronger." Junie nodded. "It's a good name, a name that can withstand hardship. And you?" she asked, though her tone suggested he wasn't accustomed to formal introductions. "Cole Reed," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "And you must be—" He trailed off. "People in the town said there was a woman, a midwife, living here." Junie tensed slightly. "Junie Rice, just Junie, and I'm no longer a midwife." "But you helped us," Cole said, looking at his daughter. "You knew what to do." "Any woman would have done the same," Junie replied, though both knew it wasn't true. Not every woman could have fed a starving child. Not every woman would have opened her door to a stranger in the middle of a blizzard. The tea was ready. Junie handed Cole a cup, watching his trembling hands struggle to hold it without spilling. He was exhausted, poorly nourished, and had probably not slept for days. Yet, he had managed to keep his daughter alive against all odds, bringing her here when hope had almost vanished. "Where are you from?" Junie asked, settling into the armchair with Lita in her arms. "Silver Creek," Cole replied, sipping the hot tea cautiously. "But we've been on the road since my wife died. I thought I could find work in the mines here, but the weather caught us on the way. We've been wandering in this storm for 3 days." Junie looked out the window at the relentless snow still falling. "You won't be able to travel for several days," she said. "Maybe a week." Cole's face darkened. "I don't want to be a burden," he said quickly. "I can sleep in the barn, help with chores, just until the storm passes." "There's no barn," Junie replied. "Only a small chicken coop." Cole looked dismayed, as if calculating whether he could survive in a chicken coop with a newborn. "You can stay here," Junie said sharply, surprising herself, "on the couch until the weather improves." Cole looked at her with such gratitude that she averted her gaze. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You saved our lives, both of us." Junie didn't respond. Instead, she looked down at the child in her arms. Lita stretched a tiny hand out from the blanket, her minuscule fingers flexing and relaxing in sleep. Without thinking, Junie extended her index finger, and the baby clutched it instinctively, holding on tightly. Amazing strength for such a tiny creature. This contact pierced her like an electric current. For the first time in 3 years, she felt not only numbness, but also pain. Yes, pain, but also something more, something buried so deeply she had forgotten its existence. Hope. Outside, the wind still howled, driving snow in hypnotic patterns across the windows. But inside the small cabin, something had changed. 3 solitary people, a desperate man, a broken woman, and an orphan, had found refuge not only from the storm, but also from the loneliness that devoured them. Junie didn't know that on the other side of the valley, the hunter Moyes Wheeler had seen the silhouette of a person carrying something towards the silent widow's cabin. She didn't know that by dawn, this image would be imprinted in his memory as something worth telling. And she didn't know that in the town below, gossip would begin to spread as soon as Moyes arrived at the Hatchet Creek Saloon with this story. She knew only one thing. After many years, her home had ceased to feel like a tomb. It had become a sanctuary, and the baby in her arms, this small stranger who had arrived with the storm, seemed like a second chance, wrapped in a blanket, fed with milk, and renewed with hope. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, erasing the evidence of their arrival. But some tracks are not so easily erased. Some tracks change the course of lives forever. Dawn came, pale and quiet, seeping through the faded curtains like an uncertain promise. Junie woke to a familiar sound, Lita stirring in the small basket she had fashioned as a cradle beside the bed. During the night, the baby had woken twice to feed, and each time Junie had responded without hesitation, as if she had been caring for her all her life. She rose slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her bones, but also something more, a sense of purpose she had forgotten. Lita looked at her with dark, attentive eyes, no longer glassy with weakness, but sparkling with the vitality of a well-fed child. "Good morning, little one," Junie whispered, lifting the girl and pressing her to her chest. The contact became natural with astonishing speed. She came out of the bedroom and saw Cole, already awake, neatly folding the blanket he had used on the couch. He had tossed more wood on the fire, and the water for tea was already boiling. He looked less spectral than he had last night. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes had lost the glassy stare of complete despair. "I hope you don't mind," he said, indicating the stove. "I thought I could help." Junie nodded and settled into the armchair to feed Lita. Cole moved around the small kitchen carefully and thoughtfully, like a person aware they were in unfamiliar territory. He made tea for both of them and placed a bowl of simple oatmeal in front of her, using supplies from the pantry. "Eat," she said softly. "You need strength." It was strange to have someone caring for her, after so many years of solitude. Stranger still that it proved pleasant. At breakfast, in comfortable silence, Cole looked out the window where the snow had finally stopped, leaving a white and transparent world. "I should leave today," he said suddenly. Junie followed his gaze outside. The snow reached their knees. The wind had piled drifts in some places, reaching their waists. The path to town was impassable for several days. "You can't," she said bluntly. "Even without the child, a man wouldn't make it to town in this snow." Cole clenched his fists on the table. "I don't want to be a burden any longer than necessary." "And what will you do when you get to town?" Junie asked. "How will you feed Lita?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cole had no answer, because there was no good answer. Without money, without family, without the prospect of immediate work, he and Lita would be in the same desperate situation as before, at Junie's door. "I'll find a way," he murmured, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. Junie looked down at Lita, who had fallen asleep in her arms after feeding. The baby looked healthy, with full rosy cheeks and deep even breathing. In 24 hours, she had transformed from dying to the picture of infant health. "Stay until the weather improves," Junie finally said. "Until you find work in the mines. Lita needs stability." Cole looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I can't keep accepting your help. At least let me earn my keep here." Thus began a strange but comforting routine. Cole became the hands and back Junie had lost after Samuel's death. He chopped wood with fierce determination, as if each split log was a small act of atonement. Cole mended the chicken coop roof, reinforced the shutters against future winds, and cleared paths in the snow to the well and woodshed. Junie watched him work from the window, feeding Lita. There was something almost desperate in his approach to every task, as if physical labor could atone for the fact that he had come to her door with nothing but pure need. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, they sat by the fire. Cole carved small toys for Lita from wood with a knife he had taken from his baggage, a simple rattle, a tiny horse, primitive figures that soothed the baby with pleasure. Junie sewed, mending Cole's clothes and making tiny things for Lita from fabric she had stored for years. They spoke little. Cole seemed to instinctively understand that Junie was not one for many words, and she valued his silent understanding. But in the silence between them, something grew. Not romance, but a deeper understanding born of recognizing loss in each other's eyes. The fifth day dawned, and Moise Wheeler descended from the mountains. Junie was in the yard, feeding the chickens, while Cole chopped wood by the woodshed. Lita slept in a basket by the door, wrapped in a blanket and protected from the cold air. It was a domestic, peaceful scene, until Moise appeared on the ridge of the hill, leaving deep snowshoe tracks on the untouched snow. Moise Wheeler was known in Cedar Ridge as a man who traded in both furs and gossip, and he had a good eye for both. He stopped at the edge of Junie's property, close enough to see clearly what was happening, but far enough not to be immediately noticed. A young man working on the silent widow's property, a woman who hadn't spoken to the townsfolk in 3 years, caring for a child who was clearly not her own. Shirtless, despite the cold, with sweat gleaming on his back, he labored with the intensity of a man who had something to prove. Moise smiled. These were the kind of stories that bought him drinks at the Hatchet Creek Saloon for weeks. Meanwhile, in town, Miriam Coach was preparing for her morning rounds when she heard the first rumors. 2 women from town had come for the expectorant she had prepared, but their voices held that particular tone Miriam had learned to recognize, the sound of a brewing scandal.
Moise says he saw smoke coming from Junie Rice's chimney all through the storm.
One whispered.
And that there was a man. What kind?
Asked the other, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity.
Young, according to Moise, and with a child.
Miriam stopped pounding her mortar. For 3 years she had been the only midwife in Cedar Ridge, building her reputation on the ruins of Junie's shattered career. She liked being the one families turned to, the moral authority Junie had lost by going into voluntary exile.
A child,
Miriam repeated, maintaining a carefully neutral tone.
That's what Moise says. A young man with a child, living in Junie Rice's house for almost a week.
The implications hung in the air like thick smoke. An unmarried woman, a young man, a child of mysterious origin. In a community where reputation was as fragile as spring ice, this was enough to ruin anyone. But Miriam was shrewd and in no hurry. First, she needed more information. How interesting, she murmured, returning to her work. I suppose Junie has finally decided to return to society? The women laughed, well aware of what Miriam had not said aloud. That evening, when Cole came for supper, he found Junie more silent than usual. Lita was awake in her arms, but Junie was staring out the window with an expression he hadn't seen before, a mixture of apprehension and almost expectation. Is everything all right? Cole asked, approaching the fire. Junie didn't answer immediately. She had seen Moise on the ridge of the hill, recognized his distinctive silhouette and manner of observation. Moise had been a hunter for 20 years. He had a good eye for detail and an even better nose for the stories those details could tell. The town will talk, she finally said. Cole tensed. About what? He asked. About you? Junie replied, choosing her words carefully. About you staying here. About Lita. Understanding spread across Cole's face like a shadow. In his desperate struggle to save his daughter, he hadn't fully grasped the social implications of his situation. An unmarried woman caring for a young man's child, nursing her as her own, in the conservative community of Cedar Ridge, this would be perceived as more than just charity. We can explain the situation, Cole said quickly, Any reasonable person will understand that you saved my life, saved Lita's life." Junie smiled sadly. "I've met many reasonable people, Cole Reed," she said, "but people are not reasonable when it comes to scandal. People are not reasonable when it comes to women who don't follow the rules, especially women who have lost their respected standing in society." "What are we to do?" Cole asked. Junie looked down at Lida, who had begun to make small sounds, indicating she was hungry again. The baby had become the center of her world in less than a week, and the thought of giving her away, of losing this second chance at motherhood, filled her with a fear she hadn't known since those feverish nights that had taken her family. "We go forward," she said simply, "and see what the wind brings." But both knew the wind had already brought trouble to their door, and unlike the snowstorm that had united them, this storm would be much harder to endure. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the clear sky, sparkling like silver pins on black velvet. The night was beautiful and calm, a perfect night for hope. But in Cedar Ridge, 3 miles away, Moise Wheeler was entering the Hatchet Creek Saloon with a story burning on his tongue like strong whiskey. And in Miriam Coach's small clinic, she was writing a carefully worded letter to the sheriff, requesting an investigation into suspicious activity on Junie Rice's property. A storm was brewing, and this time it would not be made of snow and wind, but of whispers and condemning conversations. Junie Rice, who had found peace in silence, would soon learn that some silences cannot protect her from the storms others create around her. The summons landed in Sheriff Denny Cross's hands on a gray Tuesday, 2 weeks after the gossip had turned into something more venomous than whiskey at the Hatchet Creek Saloon. Cross reluctantly held the official document, reading the formal words dictated by Reverend Bell, a man accustomed to his words carrying the force of law. "Junie Rice and Cole Merritt are hereby summoned to appear before the public court on Friday, March 3, 1882, at 2 p.m. in the Cedar Ridge Methodist Chapel to answer charges of immoral conduct and irresponsible parenting in connection with the care of minor Lida Merritt." He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. His jaw was tight. He had known Junie for 15 years, even before she lost everything she loved. He had seen her hands bring life into this world, witnessed her quiet dedication to her craft, and now he had to go up the mountain and hand her a document that treated her like a criminal. The road to Junie's cabin had improved. Cole had spent 2 weeks clearing snow and making a decent path. Cross saw smoke rising from the chimney long before he reached the door, and the sound of an axe splitting wood echoed clearly in the cold air. Cole emerged from behind the house, hearing the thud of horse hooves. The axe was still in his hands, his face already tense with worry. Lawmen didn't come up the mountain for casual chats. "Sheriff," Cole said, leaning the axe against a log, "how can I help?" Cross slowly dismounted his horse. His gaze swept over the property. It was better maintained than it had been in years. The chicken coop had a new roof, the shutters had been repaired, and there was enough firewood to last until summer. Cole stood firm. "I need to speak with you and with Mrs. Rice," Cross said. "Is she home?" The door opened before Cole could answer. Junie appeared in the doorway with Lida in her arms. Cross immediately saw what Moise Wheeler had noticed and what the whole town was whispering about. The child looked healthy and content, clearly under Junie's care, and Junie herself looked different, less spectral, as if she had returned to life. "Sheriff Cross," Junie said in a calm but cautious voice, "please, come in." Cross accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the table where Cole and Junie had shared so many silent meals over the past 2 weeks. Lida chirped softly on Junie's lap, oblivious to the tension that filled the room like thick smoke. "I'm afraid I bring unpleasant news," Cross began, taking the document from his pocket. "The Council of Elders, under the leadership of Reverend Bell, has called a public hearing for Friday." He read the accusation aloud, watching as color drained from Cole's face and Junie's shoulders tensed with each word. When he finished, silence settled between them, like an open wound. "Immoral conduct," Cole finally repeated, his voice hoarse with disbelief, "and irresponsible parenting. "Sheriff, this woman saved my daughter's life. How can that be immoral?" Cross sighed, twirling his hat in his hands. "These aren't my accusations, Cole, but the town's. There are concerns about the living arrangements here." "What concerns?" Junie asked, her voice dangerously calm. Cross looked into her gray eyes and saw the same silent determination he had admired for years. Miriam Coach raised questions about a single woman nursing another man's child, about a young man living in a woman's home without proper supervision. "Improper arrangements?" Junie repeated, and a sharp note in her tone made Cross fidget in his seat. "I know this is unfair," Junie said softly. "I know your character, but the town is concerned. They need answers." Cole abruptly stood and began pacing the small room, like a trapped animal. "Answers to what? Why I didn't let my daughter starve to death? Why I accepted help when I was desperate?" "In a small town, reputation matters," Cross said, "and here, reputation is complicated." Junie looked down at Lyda, who had begun to fall asleep in her arms. In 2 weeks, she had allowed herself to believe that this could continue, that she had a second chance at motherhood, that this family, though hastily formed, was real. Now, reality hit her like ice water. "What do they want?" she asked. "Immediate separation," Cross reluctantly replied. "Cole must find other living arrangements for the child or give her to a suitable family for adoption, and you have been advised to find a home in town where you can be properly supervised." Junie's tone became deadly. "By whom?" she asked. "By Miriam Coach." Cross didn't answer, but his silence was the answer. Cole stopped mid-stride, turned to the sheriff. "And if we refuse? If we don't appear at the hearing? Then Reverend Bell will summon external authorities," Cross said. "The territorial marshal, a man who doesn't know the situation, doesn't know you, who will only see what's on the surface." The implications hung in the air like a threat. The territorial marshal had no shared history with Junie, no memory of her past kindness to temper a judgment. He would only see what Miriam and Hiram wanted to show: improper arrangements, scandal, a breach of public morality. "How much time do we have?" Junie asked. "The hearing is Friday at 2 p.m., Cross replied. 3 days. After Cross left, Cole and Junie sat silently by the fire. Lyda woke and nursed contentedly, unaware that their world was about to shatter again. "They can separate us," Cole finally said. "I won't let them take Lyda from you, not after everything you've done for her." Junie didn't answer immediately. She thought of Cross's face, of how he had avoided her gaze while reading the accusations. There was shame and reluctance there, but also resignation. He would follow the council's orders, because that's what good men did in impossible situations.
Miriam wants this,
She finally said.
She's been waiting for an excuse to eliminate me completely.
"Why? What did you do to her?" Junie smiled bitterly.
I was a better midwife than she was. For 15 years, families chose me over her. When I left, she finally got her chance to be the sole medical authority for women in town. Now she fears my return because it seems to threaten her position.
Cole slammed his fist on the armrest of his chair in frustration. "So, all this is because of professional jealousy, a power struggle?"
Exactly.
Junie corrected him.
Now Miriam has what I used to have: respect, power, the right to judge other women's morals. She won't give that up easily.
They spent the night planning, trying to find a way to navigate the hearing while keeping Lyda and their family safe. But every scenario ended the same way: separation, scandal, or both. Friday arrived, damp and gray, with the promise of rain hanging over the town like a threat. Cedar Ridge's Methodist Chapel had never seen such a crowd as it did that day. It seemed the entire town had come to watch the spectacle. Junie entered, carrying Lyda. Cole walked beside her, tense and motionless. The whispers of conversations died down as hundreds of eyes followed their every move. Junie held her head high, her face impassive, but Cole felt a tremor in her hand when she took his to steady herself. Jerron Bell presided over the meeting from the pulpit, his face a mask of moral authority. Beside him stood Miriam Coach, dressed in her finest black clothes, her eyes gleaming with anticipation of triumph. "We are gathered here," Bell began in his booming preacher's voice, to consider a situation that has caused serious concern in our community, a situation that challenges the decent values we strive to uphold. He proceeded to outline the accusations, which sounded like mortal sins: an unmarried woman caring for a man's child, a man living unsupervised in a woman's home, the indecent act of nursing a strange child. When he finished, Jaron called Miriam to the pulpit. Miriam rose with carefully measured dignity, her skirts rustling as she walked. She addressed the assembled crowd with the confidence of a woman who knew she was in the right. "Brothers and sisters," she began, "for 3 years we have respected Junie Rice's mourning, allowed her to live in isolation, respected her pain. But what we see now is not grief," she said, her tone heavy with suggestion, "but something far more troubling." She spun a story, not just of sorrow, but of temptation and impropriety. She implied that Junie had drawn Cole in, using her own fragility to manipulate the situation. She painted her as a woman who had lost her way, using a child to fill a space in her heart that had long ached with longing. "What kind of loving mother," Miriam asked, her voice rising with practiced conviction, "would hand her child to someone living in such unsuitable conditions?" Cole felt something crack inside. Before Junie could stop him, he stood, the scrape of his chair echoing across the wooden floor. "That's not true," he cried, his voice filling the chapel. "None of what you said is true." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Jaron struck his staff, calling for calm, but Cole pressed on. "You want to hear the truth?" he said, turning to face the crowd. "The truth is, I failed. I was a father who couldn't provide for his daughter. I wandered through a snowstorm for days because I was too proud to ask for help, until it nearly cost her life. And then I came to this woman's door, holding my child who was barely breathing, with no money, no food, and no hope. And do you know what she did? She opened her door. She let us in, without questions, without judgment. She saw our need, and she acted." Junie stepped into the aisle, Lita asleep in her arms, peaceful and warm. "You want to talk about morality?" Cole's voice wavered, but his conviction grew. "Morality is a woman who gives everything she has to save a child that isn't hers. Morality is sheltering a stranger in a storm. It's doing the right thing, not for praise, not for gain, but because it's right." Then he turned to Miriam, his voice steady, but burning with pain. "And you, Mrs. Coach, what did you offer? Where were you when my daughter was dying? Would you have opened your door that night? Would you have done what she did, no matter the cost?" Miriam's face flushed, but before she could speak, Cole turned to the room once more. "If you're looking for someone to blame," he said, "blame me. Blame me for not being enough, for failing my family, for waiting too long to ask for help. But do not," his voice cracked, then rose again, "do not blame the woman who saved our lives." A heavy silence filled the room. Even Jaron Bell was quiet. Cole sat down, trembling, and took Junie's hand. Then, for the first time in 3 years, Junie Rice addressed the room. "I won't defend myself," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but clear and unwavering. "Because saving a life doesn't need a defense, compassion doesn't need an explanation, and love, real love, is never something to be ashamed of." She looked directly at Miriam. "You want me to feel ashamed, as if caring for this child was something wrong, but I won't. Lita is alive because I fed her. She is well because I loved her. If that bothers you, then the problem isn't with me." The murmurs in the crowd were different now, uncertain, soft. Some people shifted in their seats as if seeing things anew, but Jaron Bell recovered quickly. "Fine words," he said with disdain, "but they don't change the facts. The conditions here are improper and must be corrected." "Says who?" came a voice from the back. Everyone turned. Sheriff Cross was walking down the center aisle, his face set with quiet resolve. "Sheriff?" Bell said, surprised. Cross stopped at the front, his gaze moving over the room. "I looked into all of this," he said, "and I didn't find wrongdoing. I found a man in need, a woman with compassion, and a child who is safe and thriving. I've served this county for 15 years. I know what real crime looks like. And this is just kindness, humanity, love. If that's what we're calling improper now, then maybe the real problem is what we've become. The silence after his words was different from the usual silence in Junie's cabin. It was filled with unspoken words, with decisions hanging in the air like autumn leaves before falling. Before leaving, Cole meticulously packed his few belongings, folding each item with the care of a man who had lost so much that even the humblest objects had acquired a sacred meaning for him. Junie watched him from her armchair by the fire, Lita asleep on her chest. In the 3 weeks they had been together, the baby had grown noticeably. Her cheeks full, her limbs strong, and she had developed a special ability to hold on tightly, a sign of a loved child. "You don't have to go," Junie finally said, breaking the long silence. Cole stopped, folding a worn shirt. "Yes, I do," he replied, not looking up. "You heard Bell at the hearing. This isn't over. He'll call in outside authorities, as Cross said, and when that happens, things will be worse for you if I'm still here. And what about Lita?" Junie's voice was calm, but there was steel in her resolve. "How will you feed her?" This question had tormented Cole for days. In town, he had secretly inquired about wet nurses, but few women with milk were already nursing their own children. Miriam Coach had made it clear that any woman who helped Cole would face the same social condemnation as Junie. Without money for such a service, his options were catastrophically limited. "I'll find a way," he murmured, but both knew it was empty hope masked by determination. Junie stood and went to the window, where the tracks Cole had left after weeks of tireless work were visible. The yard was neat, the firewood stacked with military precision, the path to town more discernible than it had been in years. He had transformed her small world with his presence, and now he was leaving, taking with him the life he had helped create. "What happened to your wife?" she suddenly asked, turning to him. Cole stopped, his hands motionless on his packed clothes. It was the question he had been expecting, but feared to answer. "Bleeding," he finally said. "After childbirth, the baby was not positioned correctly, there were complications. The midwife did everything she could. She lost a lot of blood and died 3 days after giving birth." His voice broke on the last words, and Junie could see the guilt he carried like a heavy burden on his shoulders. "Did you love her?" Junie asked. "Yes," Cole replied without hesitation, but then fell silent, as if about to say something dangerous but stopped. Cole finally looked at her, and in his eyes Junie saw something that made her hold her breath. "Not the way I should have loved the woman I was going to spend the rest of my life with. Emma was good, kind, everything a man could wish for. But we were more like partners, friends who decided to marry for practical reasons." Junie understood the unspoken confession, the heavy burden of a life lived with regret for what could have been. "And now what do you want?" she asked. "I want Lita to have a mother," Cole said fiercely. "I want her to have someone who loves her the way you do." His voice broke, and he had to swallow before continuing. "I want to stay here with you and build something real, something I choose, not something desperation forces upon me." These words hung between them like a fragile bridge over an abyss. Junie felt something stir in her chest, something she had carefully buried for 3 years. It wasn't just the maternal feeling that had awakened within her, but something deeper and more complete. "And what about your pride?" she asked, because she needed to understand all sides of this decision. Cole smiled sadly. "My pride almost killed my daughter. My pride made me wander in a blizzard instead of asking for help when it was needed. I think I've paid enough for my pride already." At that moment, a loud knock echoed at the door.